On November 24, 1971, a man in a business suit handed a flight attendant a note. She almost threw it away. Inside that note was a bomb threat that would launch the only unsolved skyjacking in American history. By midnight, he'd be gone. $200,000 vanished with him. And 54 years later, we still don't know his real name. This is the case of D.B. Cooper. Thanksgiving Eve, 1971. Portland International Airport. The rain came down in sheets, the way it always does in the Pacific Northwest during November. Travelers packed the terminal, desperate to get home for the holiday. Flight 305 to Seattle was running on time. A Boeing 727, 36 passengers, 6 crew members. Nobody suspected this would become the flight that changed aviation forever. Among the crowd of businessmen and families stood a man in his mid-40s. Dark suit, black tie, white shirt. He wore dark sunglasses despite the overcast weather. He carried a briefcase and nothing else. No luggage, no carry-on bag. At 2:50 p.m., he purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle under the name Dan Cooper. Cash payment, $20. The ticket agent later described him as unremarkable. Average height, maybe 5'10" or 11. Average build, around 170 pounds. Middle-aged, with dark hair, possibly brown or black. Olive complexion. Nothing about him screamed danger. He was polite, calm, forgettable. Exactly what you'd want to be if you were planning to disappear. But here's what nobody noticed at the time. The man who called himself Dan Cooper was studying everything. The aircraft layout, the crew positions, the passenger count. He'd chosen this flight deliberately. Northwest Orient Airlines. Flight 305 was a short hop, just 30 minutes in the air. The 727 had a unique feature that other aircraft didn't have. A rear air stair that could be lowered during flight. He knew this. He'd planned for this. At 2:50 p.m., passengers began boarding. Cooper took seat 18C, the last row on the right side of the aircraft, next to the window. Strategic positioning. He could see everyone who walked past him. He had a clear view of the rear exit. And he was as far from the cockpit as possible, giving him maximum reaction time if things went wrong. 20-year-old flight attendant Florence Schaffner worked the aft section of the cabin. She remembers Cooper ordering a bourbon and soda once the plane was airborne. He paid in cash. He seemed relaxed, almost bored. Then, somewhere around 3 p.m., just after takeoff, he handed her a note. Florence Schaffner almost didn't read the note. She assumed it was a passenger hitting on her, something flight attendants dealt with constantly in 1971. She tucked it into her pocket without looking. But Cooper leaned toward her and said something that changed everything. "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Her blood went cold. She pulled out the note and read it. The message was written in neat, all-capital letters. "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I will use it if necessary. I want you to sit next to me. You are being hijacked." Schaffner sat down beside him, trying to remain calm. Cooper opened his briefcase just enough for her to see inside. Red cylinders, wires, a large battery. It looked exactly like a bomb. He snapped the briefcase shut and gave her his demands. $200,000 in $20 bills, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle. The plane was to circle until the money and parachutes were delivered to the aircraft. If his demands weren't met, he'd blow up the plane. Imagine being Florence Schaffner in that moment. You're 20 years old. You're responsible for the safety of everyone in that cabin, and you're sitting next to a man who just showed you what appears to be an explosive device." She kept her composure. She walked to the cockpit and informed Captain William Scott of the situation. Captain Scott, a veteran pilot with decades of experience, immediately radioed Seattle-Tacoma International Airport and Northwest Orient's Operations Center. The message was simple. "We have a hijacker on board. He has a bomb. He wants money and parachutes." The response on the ground was swift. This wasn't the first hijacking of the era. Between 1968 and 1972, there were over 130 hijackings of American aircraft, most involving demands to fly to Cuba. But this was different. Cooper wasn't demanding passage to another country. He wanted cash. He wanted parachutes. And he was calm, methodical, and clearly knew what he was doing. The FBI was notified immediately. Northwest Orient Airlines contacted their insurance company. The demand for $200,000 in 1971 would be equivalent to about $1.5 million today. The airline's president authorized the payment without hesitation. 36 lives hung in the balance. For nearly 2 hours, Flight 305 circled the Seattle area while preparations were made on the ground. Cooper remained calm throughout. He continued drinking bourbon. He chatted casually with Florence Schaffner, even offering to request meals for the passengers. When she asked if he had a grudge against Northwest Orient, he replied, "I don't have a grudge against your airline, miss. I just have a grudge." But here's what makes this so chilling. Cooper demonstrated detailed knowledge of the aircraft. He knew the 727's capabilities. He knew its range. He knew about the aft air stair. When Schaffner asked where he wanted to go after Seattle, he specified flying to Mexico City via Reno with a refueling stop. He demanded the aircraft fly unpressurized, below 10,000 feet, with the wing flaps lowered to 15 degrees. These weren't random demands. These were specifications designed to allow a parachute jump at a survivable altitude and speed. At 5:24 p.m., Flight 305 finally landed at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Cooper's demands had been met. $200,000 in $20 bills, each serial number photographed by the FBI. 4 parachutes, 2 primary chutes, and 2 reserve chutes, provided by a local skydiving school. A fuel truck waited on the tarmac. Cooper allowed all 36 passengers to deplane once the money and parachutes were delivered. He kept the flight crew. Captain Scott, First Officer Bob Ratadzak, Flight Engineer Harold Anderson, and Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow, who had taken over from Florence Schaffner. The aircraft was refueled while Cooper examined the parachutes and money in the cabin. At 7:40 p.m., with only 4 crew members and 1 hijacker on board, Flight 305 took off again. Destination: Mexico City, by way of Reno. But Cooper had no intention of landing in Mexico. Somewhere over the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, he planned to do something nobody had ever successfully done before. At 8 p.m. on November 24th, 1971, Flight 305 reached 10,000 feet somewhere over southwestern Washington state. Cooper ordered Tina Mucklow to go to the cockpit and stay there. He told the crew to keep the aircraft unpressurized, maintain slow speed around 170 knots, and keep the wing flaps at 15 degrees. Then he did something that sealed his legend. He told them not to enter the cabin under any circumstances. At approximately 8:13 p.m., a warning light illuminated in the cockpit. The aft air stair had been activated. The stairway was extending from the rear of the aircraft into the night sky. Captain Scott felt a sudden change in air pressure. The aircraft's tail dipped slightly, indicating a shift in weight distribution. At 8:13 p.m., somewhere over the dense forests near the Washington-Oregon border, D.B. Cooper jumped into history. And then he vanished. The largest and most expensive manhunt in FB-1 history began immediately. Military jets had been scrambling to follow Flight 305 since its departure from Seattle, but the rainy night and cloud cover made visual tracking impossible. The pilots lost sight of the 727 repeatedly. When the aircraft landed in Reno at 10:15 p.m. with the aft stairs still deployed and the cabin empty, authorities realized Cooper had already jumped, but they had no idea where. The FBI designated the case NORJAK, Northwest Hijacking. Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach took the lead. His team faced an immediate problem. They had no precise jump location. Based on the flight path, timeline, and when the aft stair warning activated, Cooper could have jumped anywhere along a 25-mile corridor in southwestern Washington, possibly near the town of Oriel, just north of the Columbia River. But here's what made the investigation nearly impossible from the start. The drop zone included some of the most rugged, inaccessible terrain in the continental United States. Dense forests, steep ravines, the Cascade Mountain Range. In late November, the area was experiencing severe weather. Heavy rain, strong winds, near freezing temperatures. If Cooper survived the jump, he'd landed in a wilderness that could kill an experienced survivalist, let alone a middle-aged man in a business suit. The FBI deployed hundreds of agents. Search parties combed the suspected drop zone for weeks. They used helicopters, ground teams, and trained search dogs. They interviewed every resident within a 50-mile radius. They searched cabins, barns, and outbuildings. They monitored every hospital and medical facility in the region. Nothing. No parachute, no body, no money, no trace of Dan Cooper anywhere. Imagine this. A man jumps from a commercial aircraft at 10,000 feet in the dark, in a rainstorm, wearing a business suit and loafers over mountainous wilderness. The temperature at that altitude was 7 degrees below zero. He had no helmet, no jumpsuit, no proper footwear. He was carrying a 21-pound bag of cash. Professional skydivers insisted the jump was suicidal. The odds of survival were astronomical. The FBI focused on the money. Those weren't just any $20 bills. Before delivery, agents photographed every serial number, 10,000 bills in total. The serial numbers were distributed to banks across the United States. Any attempt to spend the ransom money would immediately identify Cooper's location or identity. The FBI waited for those bills to surface. Days passed, weeks, months, years. The money never appeared in circulation. The investigation expanded to Cooper's description and behavior on the flight. The FBI worked with Boeing engineers to understand exactly what Cooper would have faced during the jump. The aft air stair, when deployed at 200 miles per hour, creates tremendous wind force and turbulence. Jumpers using that exit during test jumps described it as being thrown into a tornado. Cooper would have had to fight against 200-mile-per-hour winds just to leave the aircraft. Once free, he'd be in total darkness, in a storm, with no lights or landmarks to guide him. Special Agent Himmelsbach became convinced Cooper died in the jump. The evidence seemed overwhelming. The brutal weather conditions, the dangerous aircraft exit, the rough terrain, Cooper's apparent lack of professional skydiving experience based on his parachute selection. Cooper had chosen a military-grade NB6 reserve parachute that couldn't be steered and was designed for emergency use only. He'd also taken a training parachute that had been sewn shut and was completely unusable. These weren't the choices of an experienced jumper. 5 years later, everything changed. On February 10th, 1980, 8-year-old Brian Ingram was on a family camping trip along the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. He was digging in the sandy riverbank, building a fire pit, when his hand struck something unusual. Bundles of deteriorated $20 bills. Rotted rubber bands held them together, barely. The bills were badly damaged, compressed together, but the serial numbers were still legible. Brian's father called the FBI. Agents arrived within hours. They checked the serial numbers against their records. The bills matched. This was Cooper's ransom money. After nearly a decade, the first physical evidence of D.B. Cooper had finally surfaced. The discovery location was significant. Tena Bar, a sandy beach on the north shore of the Columbia River, roughly 20 miles downstream from the suspected jump zone. Investigators found $5,800 in total, 294 $20 bills. But this discovery raised more questions than it answered. How did the money get there? Did Cooper die in the river and his body wash downstream, leaving the bills behind? Did he bury the money there himself before disappearing? Did someone else find the money and hide it? The bills were severely degraded, suggesting they'd been in the water or underground for years. But geologists and hydrologists who studied the site couldn't agree on how the money arrived there. The FBI launched new tests. Diatom analysis, examining microscopic algae on the bills, suggested the money had been submerged in water before being deposited on the riverbank. But the bills showed layering patterns indicating they might have been buried rather than washed ashore. The rubber bands holding the bundles together had deteriorated in a way consistent with prolonged underground storage, not river transport. But here's what nobody noticed at the time of the Tena Bar discovery. The location where the money was found didn't align with the Columbia River's flow patterns in 1971. Advanced hydrological modeling conducted years later showed that if Cooper's body or the money bag had landed in the river near the suspected drop zone, the current would have carried it miles past Tena Bar, not directly to that specific beach. The money seemed to have been placed there deliberately. The investigation intensified around potential suspects. Over the decades, the FBI investigated more than 800 individuals. Some were reported by family members who believed their fathers or uncles matched Cooper's description. Others were con artists seeking attention. A few became serious suspects based on compelling circumstantial evidence. Richard Floyd McCoy, Jr. was arrested just 5 months after the Cooper hijacking for a nearly identical crime. On April 7, 1972, McCoy hijacked United Airlines Flight 855 using a similar method: a bomb threat, a ransom demand, and a parachute escape over Utah. He was captured 2 days later with the ransom money. McCoy was a Vietnam War veteran, an experienced parachutist, and matched Cooper's general description. The similarities were striking, but the FBI eventually ruled McCoy out. The physical descriptions didn't match precisely enough. Flight attendants who saw Cooper up close insisted McCoy was too young. Cooper appeared to be in his mid-40s, while McCoy was 29. McCoy was also a skilled jumper who wouldn't have made the amateur parachute choices Cooper made. McCoy died in a shootout with FBI agents in 1974 while attempting to escape from prison. Dwayne Webber became a suspect in 1995 when his widow, Jo Webber, contacted the FBI after his death. On his deathbed, Webber allegedly confessed, saying, "I am Dan Cooper." Jo found suspicious items in their home: a 1971 Northwest Orient ticket stub, old Northwest Airlines pins, and a hidden bag of money. Webber had been in the right area during the hijacking and had skydiving experience, but DNA testing in 2011 ruled him out definitively. Kenneth Christiansen was another compelling suspect. A former Northwest Orient Flight attendant and military paratrooper, Christiansen matched Cooper's description precisely. He purchased a house with cash shortly after the hijacking, despite having no apparent source of income. Before his death in 1994, he allegedly told his brother, "There's something you should know, but I cannot tell you." His brother became convinced Kenneth was Cooper. However, the FBI found no concrete evidence linking him to the crime. Robert Rackstraw, a former Army pilot with Special Forces training, became a prime suspect in later years. Rackstraw had extensive parachute experience, demolitions training, and a criminal history of fraud. He matched Cooper's age and description. Investigators found coded letters supposedly sent by Cooper to newspapers that allegedly pointed to Rackstraw. He died in 2019, never charged, always denying involvement. But here's what the FBI learned after decades of investigation. Physical evidence was more valuable than eyewitness testimony or circumstantial links. In 2001, agents found particles on Cooper's clip-on tie left behind on the aircraft after the hijacking that would eventually provide the most significant clue in the case. In 2009, Special Agent Larry Carr made a decision that changed the trajectory of the investigation. He took Cooper's clip-on tie, recovered from the Seat 18C after the hijacking, and sent it for advanced forensic analysis. The tie had been in FBI storage for 38 years. Technology had advanced exponentially since 1971. Carr wanted to know what microscopic evidence might still be clinging to the fabric. The results were stunning. Electron microscopy revealed particles of pure titanium, as well as traces of aluminum, stainless steel, and other rare metals. These weren't common materials in 1971. Titanium was extremely expensive and used in highly specialized industries: aerospace engineering, chemical processing, and metallurgical research. The particle combination suggested Cooper worked in advanced manufacturing or aerospace development. But the most revealing discovery was bismuth and aluminum oxide particles in a specific ratio that indicated exposure to specialized alloys used in the aerospace industry during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Cooper wasn't just familiar with aircraft from a passenger's perspective. He likely worked directly with aircraft manufacturing or maintenance, possibly at Boeing, Lockheed, or one of their subcontractors. This evidence narrowed the suspect pool dramatically. Cooper was likely an engineer or technician at an aerospace facility, someone with regular access to specialized materials and advanced metallurgical processes. The particle analysis suggested he worked in the Pacific Northwest, Boeing's primary manufacturing region, and had specific knowledge of the 727 aircraft because he worked with or around them professionally. Imagine how this changed the investigation. For decades, the FBI had been chasing military paratroopers, con artists, and adventurers. But Cooper wasn't a professional criminal or a daredevil seeking thrills. He was likely a white-collar worker, possibly struggling financially, who used his technical knowledge to plan the perfect crime. He knew the aircraft's vulnerabilities because he'd helped build or maintain them. The FBI cross-referenced Boeing employment records with their suspect database. They looked for employees who left Boeing or related companies around the time of the hijacking, particularly those with financial problems, criminal records, or sudden, unexplained wealth. But here's the problem. Boeing employed tens of thousands of workers in the Seattle area in 1971. Many had access to titanium and specialized alloys. Without a specific suspect to test, the particle evidence was suggestive but not conclusive. In 2011, the FBI made another forensic breakthrough: DNA analysis. Advances in DNA extraction allowed scientists to pull genetic material from the tie even after 4 decades. They isolated a partial DNA profile from epithelial cells, skin cells, left behind when Cooper wore the tie. For the first time, investigators had D.B. Cooper's actual genetic signature. The DNA was run through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contains genetic profiles of millions of convicted criminals. No match. Cooper had no criminal record before the hijacking, or if he did, DNA wasn't collected from those early arrests. The FBI also tested DNA from every serious suspect who had died, comparing genetic samples from relatives or preserved biological material. Kenneth Christiansen, not a match. Dwayne Weber, not a match. Robert Rackstraw never provided a sample before his death, and relatives refused posthumous testing. The investigation expanded to forensic linguistics. Experts analyzed the language in Cooper's note and his recorded communications with the crew. His word choices, grammar, and phrasing suggested someone with technical education, but not necessarily college-level writing skills. He used aviation terminology correctly, referring to flaps and altitude with precision, but his syntax suggested practical experience rather than formal aeronautical engineering training. He was likely a technician or mechanic, not a design engineer. But here's what makes this case so frustrating. Every breakthrough revealed how close Cooper came to making a fatal mistake, yet he somehow avoided them all. He left DNA on the tie, but never entered it into the criminal database. He worked with rare materials that could identify his employer, but that employer was one of thousands of aerospace workers. He spent months or years planning the hijacking, studying the 727, selecting the perfect flight, yet he made amateur mistakes in his parachute selection. Who was this man? 5 years later, everything changed again. On July 12, 2016, the FBI made an announcement that shocked true crime followers worldwide. The D.B. Cooper investigation was being closed. After 45 years, thousands of leads, and countless hours of investigative work, the Bureau was suspending active investigation. Resources were needed for more pressing cases. Unless someone walked into an FBI office with the parachute or concrete evidence of Cooper's identity, the case would remain unsolved indefinitely. But citizen investigators weren't ready to give up. In November 2017, amateur researcher Eric Ulis obtained permission from the FBI to search Tana Bar, the site where Brian Ingram found the ransom money in 1980, with modern ground-penetrating radar and metal detection equipment. The FBI had searched the area in 1980, but technology had advanced dramatically in 37 years. Ulis believed more money might still be buried there. His team found something the FBI had missed: 3 small fabric fragments and a piece of foam consistent with a parachute rig from the early 1970s. These items were partially buried about 15 feet from where the money had been found. Ulis sent the fabric to a lab for testing. The results showed the material was consistent with military-grade parachute fabric used in the late 1960s and early 1970s, exactly matching the type of chutes delivered to Cooper. The discovery reignited debate. Had Cooper landed near the Columbia River, buried some of the money, and escaped? Or did he die on impact, his body washed into the river, depositing the money and parachute fragments on the bank? The condition of the fabric suggested prolonged exposure to river water and sediment, supporting the theory that Cooper's body ended up in the Columbia River after the jump. In 2020, a team of engineers and scientists at Oklahoma City University conducted computational fluid dynamics simulations of Cooper's jump. Using weather data from November 24, 1971, the aircraft's speed and altitude, and known characteristics of the parachutes Cooper took, they modeled thousands of possible descent scenarios. Their findings were remarkable. The simulations showed Cooper would have experienced severe wind drift during descent, possibly 3 to 5 miles from his initial jump point due to the storm's powerful winds. If he jumped where the FBI believed, near Ariel, Washington, he wouldn't have landed near the Columbia River at all. He would have come down in the dense Cascade Forest, miles from any road or settlement. But if he jumped even 2 minutes earlier or later than estimated, his landing zone could shift dramatically. The study also examined the survival question. Could Cooper have survived the jump? The engineers calculated that with the reserve parachute he selected, the NB6, his rate of descent would have been approximately 18 to 22 feet per second. Fast but survivable for someone who knew how to execute a proper parachute landing fall. However, in total darkness, in a storm, over forested terrain, the odds of avoiding trees, power lines, or fatal impact with the ground were less than 5%. But here's what nobody expected. In December 2022, a YouTuber named Dan Grider claimed to have solved the case. Grider, a pilot and skydiving instructor, alleged that Cooper was Richard McCoy, the same suspect the FBI had ruled out 50 years earlier. Grider claimed he'd found Cooper's parachute and harness on property once owned by McCoy's family in North Carolina. He contacted McCoy's children, who allegedly provided the parachute and corroborated their father's involvement. Grider's evidence was compelling. The parachute harness contained a modification that matched the modified reserve chute delivered to Cooper. The location where it was found suggested deliberate hiding, and McCoy's own children confirmed their father had made suspicious comments about the Cooper hijacking before his death in 1974. If true, this would be the definitive answer to 50 years of mystery. In early 2023, the FBI reopened limited investigation based on Grider's claims. They took possession of the parachute and harness for forensic analysis. As of 2025, those test results have not been publicly released. The FBI has neither confirmed nor denied that the parachute belonged to D.B. Cooper. but the fact that they reopened the case at all suggests the evidence warranted serious examination. Meanwhile, advanced DNA genealogy, the same technology that solved the Golden State Killer case, offers new hope. In 2024, private forensic labs specializing in genetic genealogy expressed interest in analyzing Cooper's DNA profile using familial matching techniques. By comparing Cooper's DNA to public ancestry databases containing millions of genetic profiles, investigators could potentially identify Cooper's relatives, building a family tree that leads directly to his identity. But there's a catch. This technique requires authorization from the FBI to use their DNA sample, plus funding for the expensive analysis and willing participation from potential family members. As of 2025, negotiations are ongoing, but no DNA genealogy investigation has been authorized. The most recent development came in August 2024 when researchers at the University of Chicago published a study on the Tina bar money using isotope analysis, a technique that examines atomic signatures in materials to determine their history and exposure to environmental elements. Their findings suggested the bills were not continuously exposed to river water from 1971 to 1980, but rather were buried or stored in a sealed container for several years before being deposited at Tina Bar sometime in the late 1970s. Imagine what this means. Someone had access to Cooper's money years after the hijacking and deliberately placed it on that riverbank. Was it Cooper himself trying to seed evidence that he died in the river? Was it an accomplice disposing of evidence? Or was it a third party who found the money and later abandoned it? 54 years have passed since D.B. Cooper jumped into the night. 54 years of investigation, speculation, theories, and dead ends. And yet, this case refuses to fade from public consciousness. Why? Part of the answer is the audacity of the crime itself. In an era when hijackings were common, Cooper did something unique. He didn't want political asylum or ideological attention. He wanted money, and he wanted to vanish. And unlike every other hijacker of that era, he succeeded. He beat the system. He outsmarted the FBI. He became a ghost. But there's something deeper that makes this case resonate across generations. D.B. Cooper represents the ultimate anti-establishment figure of his time. In 1971, America was fracturing over Vietnam, civil rights, and Watergate. Trust in institutions was collapsing. Cooper's hijacking was audacious, yet remarkably non-violent. He didn't hurt anyone. He was polite to the crew. He took money from an insurance company, not individuals. In the cultural moment of 1971, he became a folk hero to some, a working man who beat the system. But here's what people forget. Cooper's crime fundamentally changed American aviation forever. Before Cooper, passengers could walk onto aircraft with virtually no screening. After Cooper, metal detectors became mandatory. Carry-on luggage was searched. The aft stairs on 727 aircraft were modified to prevent in-flight deployment, a feature now known as the Cooper vane. Every security measure you experience at airports today traces back, in part, to the man in seat 18C. The psychological profile of Cooper reveals a fascinating paradox. He planned meticulously, choosing the right aircraft, the right route, the right weather conditions. Yet he made critical errors, taking a non-steerable reserve chute, jumping in a business suit, selecting loafers instead of boots. He demonstrated expert knowledge of aviation, yet amateur understanding of parachuting. He was simultaneously brilliant and reckless, calculated and impulsive. How does one person embody such contradictions? The FBI's final assessment before closing the case in 2016 concluded that Cooper likely died during or shortly after the jump. The evidence supporting this theory is substantial. The brutal weather conditions, his inadequate clothing and equipment, the lack of any ransom money appearing in circulation, the absence of any confirmed sightings despite extensive investigation. If Cooper survived, he never spent a single dollar of his ransom. He never sought medical treatment for what would certainly have been significant injuries. He never told anyone his secret, or if he did, they kept it until death. But here's what keeps the case alive: the possibility, however slim, that Cooper survived. The possibility that somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, an elderly man knows exactly what happened on Flight 305. The possibility that the money at Tenor Bar was planted deliberately, a final misdirection from a man who spent 50 years looking over his shoulder. The possibility that the greatest escape in American criminal history was exactly that, a successful escape. The impact on those involved is profound. Florence Schaffner, the flight attendant who received Cooper's note, lived with the memory until her death in 2017. She gave hundreds of interviews over the decades, each time reliving those terrifying moments in Seat 18C. Captain William Scott retired from Northwest Orient, but never stopped wondering about the passenger who vanished from his aircraft. FBI agent Ralph Himmelsbach, who led the initial investigation, wrote a book about the case and maintained until his death in 2008 that Cooper died in the wilderness. And Brian Ingram, the boy who found the money. He's now in his 50s, and he still owns some of those deteriorated $20 bills, kept as artifacts of his role in history's greatest unsolved hijacking. He's been interviewed countless times, always expressing the same wish, that someone, somewhere, knows the truth and will finally come forward. The cultural legacy of D.B. Cooper extends far beyond the crime itself. He's been referenced in countless books, films, television shows, and songs. D.B. Cooper became shorthand for the perfect crime, the impossible escape. He inspired copycat hijackings throughout the 1970s, all unsuccessful, all resulting in arrests. Cooper remains the only one who got away. But there's a darker side to Cooper's legend that often gets overlooked. His actions terrorized innocent people. The flight attendants on Flight 305 suffered lasting psychological trauma. The passengers spent hours believing they might die, and Cooper's success inspired dozens of dangerous hijackings that did result in deaths. The romance of the outlaw obscures the reality of the crime. Modern forensic psychologists who've studied the case believe Cooper may have been suicidal. The jump itself, in those conditions, with that equipment, had such low survival probability that it resembles an elaborate suicide attempt disguised as an escape. Perhaps Cooper didn't care whether he survived. Perhaps the money was never the point. Perhaps he wanted to become a legend, to leave behind a mystery so perfect that it would outlive him by decades. If that was his goal, he succeeded completely. Today, in 2025, the case remains exactly where it's been for 54 years, unsolved, unresolved, and utterly fascinating. The evidence we have is tantalizing, but incomplete. We have Cooper's tie, containing particles that point to aerospace work. We have his DNA profile, waiting for the technology and authorization to unlock its secrets. We have $5,800 in deteriorated $20 bills that somehow ended up on a riverbank 20 miles from the suspected jump zone. We have parachute fragments that may or may not be from Cooper's rig. And we have a parachute harness that Dan Grider claims belonged to Richard McCoy, evidence the FBI is still analysing as of this writing. But we don't have answers to the most fundamental questions. Did Cooper survive the jump? The physics suggests no, but the absence of a body suggests maybe. If he died, where is he? The Cascade Wilderness has been searched extensively, but it's vast, dangerous terrain where a body could remain undiscovered indefinitely. If he survived, how did he avoid spending any of the marked bills? How did he explain his injuries? How did he live the rest of his life knowing what he'd done? Who was Dan Cooper? Not D.B. Cooper. That's a media error that stuck. The real name on the ticket was Dan Cooper. Was it an alias borrowed from a French-Canadian comic book character known for parachuting adventures? Was it his real name? Was he Richard McCoy, as Dan Grider claims? Was he one of the 800 other suspects investigated over the decades? Or was he someone nobody ever suspected, a man who took his secret to the grave? Why did he do it? Financial desperation is the obvious answer, but Cooper's calm demeanor and detailed planning suggest something more complex. Was it revenge against Northwest Orient specifically, or the airline industry in general? Was it a political statement disguised as a robbery? Was it a suicide mission with a cash prize? We may never know his true motivation. And here's the question that haunts every investigator who's touched this case. What did we miss? With 54 years of hindsight, what piece of evidence was overlooked in 1971? What witness dismissed their observation as irrelevant? What forensic technique not yet invented could crack this case wide open? The families of suspected Coopers live with their own questions. The children of Richard McCoy, Kenneth Christiansen, and Robert Rackstraw have all, at various times, confronted the possibility that their fathers were the legendary hijacker. Imagine learning that your parent might be responsible for the crime of the century. Some have embraced it, even profited from it with books and interviews. Others have denied it vehemently, defending their family names against speculation and accusation. For the FBI agents who worked NORJAK over the decades, the case represents both professional frustration and personal obsession. Ralph Himmelsbach spent 30 years pursuing Cooper before retirement. Larry Carr inherited the case in 2007 and revolutionized it with modern forensics before moving on to other assignments. Countless agents have contributed hundreds of hours to a case with no resolution, no closure, no final report stamped solved. But here's what we know for certain. On November 24th, 1971, a man boarded a plane in Portland under a fake name. He carried a bomb or something convincing enough to fool experienced flight crew. He extorted $200,000 and 4 parachutes. He released all the passengers unharmed. He jumped from a 727 into a November storm at 10,000 feet. And he vanished so completely that 5 decades of investigation couldn't find him. That's not speculation. That's not theory. That's documented fact. Everything else, his survival, his identity, his fate, remains mystery. As of December 2025, the D.B. Cooper investigation exists in a strange limbo. The FBI officially suspended active investigation in 2016, but developments like Dan Grider's parachute discovery have prompted limited re-examination of specific evidence. The case is neither fully open nor fully closed. It's in a category the Bureau rarely acknowledges. Perpetually pending. The physical evidence remains in FBI custody. The tie, the money from Tina Bar, the parachute fragments found by Eric Ulis, and now potentially the parachute harness claimed to be from Richard McCoy's property. All of this evidence is available for testing with new technologies as they emerge. The Bureau has stated that significant new evidence or credible leads would justify reopening full investigation, but what constitutes significant new evidence in 2025? The particle analysis from Cooper's tie has been public knowledge since 2009, yet hasn't produced a definitive suspect. The DNA profile exists, but hasn't matched anyone in criminal databases. The money at Tina Bar has been studied exhaustively with conflicting conclusions. What would it take to finally solve this case? Most experts agree on three possibilities for resolution. First, DNA genealogy. If private forensic genealogists gained access to Cooper's DNA profile and permission to use consumer ancestry databases, they might build a family tree leading to Cooper's identity within months. This technique has solved dozens of cold cases since 2018, including murders from the 1970s and 80s. But it requires FBI cooperation, significant funding, and some luck. Cooper would need to have relatives who've submitted DNA to ancestry services. Second, confession or family disclosure. If Cooper survived and is still alive, he'd be in his 90s or hundreds now, likely in declining health. Deathbed confessions happen. Alternatively, his children or grandchildren might come forward with evidence after his death, as happened with the Golden State Killer case. Family members often discover incriminating evidence when settling estates or cleaning out homes. Third, environmental discovery. Hikers, hunters, and outdoor enthusiasts continue to explore the Cascade Wilderness. Climate change is altering the landscape, melting snow, shifting rivers, exposing areas that were inaccessible in 1971. Cooper's parachute, his briefcase, his remains. Any of these could surface at any time, especially if he died closer to civilization than the FBI estimated. But here's the reality that frustrates both investigators and true crime enthusiasts. This case may never be solved. Cooper may have died in the jump, his body buried under decades of forest growth in a location that will never be discovered. He may have survived, lived a quiet life under his real name, and died decades ago without ever revealing his secret. The truth may be sitting in an archived file that no one thought to re-examine. Or the truth may be so mundane, so anticlimactic, that it would disappoint everyone who's romanticized this mystery for half a century. That's the curse of cold cases. They haunt us precisely because they're unresolved. Our minds crave closure, answers, resolution. We want to know who done it, even when the who might be someone entirely ordinary who got lucky once and never told a soul. Behind every cold case are human beings whose lives were forever altered. The D.B. Cooper case is no exception. Florence Schaffner lived with nightmares for years after the hijacking. She replayed those moments constantly. The note, the bomb, the conversation with a man who might have killed everyone on that plane. She second-guessed every word she said to Cooper, wondering if she could have handled it differently. The psychological toll of being the primary contact with a hijacker of being responsible for communicating his demands while keeping passengers calm marked her for life. Tina Mucklow, the flight attendant who spent the most time with Cooper during the second leg of the flight, left the airline industry entirely. She became a nun, dedicating her life to spiritual service. In the few interviews she's given over the decades, she's described the experience as transformative. Not in a positive way, but in a way that fundamentally changed her understanding of human nature and her place in the world. Captain William Scott and his crew carried the weight of losing a passenger, even though they followed Cooper's instructions precisely and endangered no one unnecessarily. Pilots are trained to bring everyone home safely. Cooper's successful escape felt like a professional failure, even though it wasn't. Scott rarely spoke publicly about the hijacking, preferring to let the investigation proceed without his commentary. The families of serious suspects have suffered too. Imagine being Karen McCoy, Richard Floyd McCoy's widow, who has spent 50 years answering questions about whether her husband was D.B. Cooper. Or being Kenneth Christiansen's brother, convinced his sibling was the hijacker, but never able to prove it definitively. These families live in perpetual uncertainty, their reputations tied to speculation and circumstantial evidence. And what about Cooper himself, whoever he was? If he survived, he lived with the knowledge that he'd committed a federal crime, that the FBI was actively searching for him, that any slip-up would end in arrest. He could never spend the money without risking exposure. He could never tell anyone without risking betrayal. If Cooper lived a long life after November 1971, it was a life of silence and paranoia. Is that freedom? Or is that a different kind of prison? The victims in this case aren't just the people on Flight 305, they're everyone whose life intersected with D.B. Cooper and his mystery. The investigators who spent careers chasing leads, the families of suspects who lived under suspicion, the journalists who built careers covering the case, the amateur sleuths who became obsessed with solving it. This case has consumed thousands of people over 5 decades. That's part of its cost. There's a small town in Washington called Ariel, population about 200 people, located in the heart of the suspected drop zone. Every year, on the weekend before Thanksgiving, they hold a festival called Cooper Days, celebrating the area's connection to America's most famous unsolved hijacking. There's a parade, costume contests, parachuting demonstrations, and endless speculation about what happened to the man who might have landed nearby. This is what D.B. Cooper has become. Folklore. A regional legend, a national obsession, a symbol of something larger than the crime itself. He represents the last era when a single individual could pull off something this audacious and disappear completely. In our age of surveillance cameras, digital tracking, and instant global communication, a crime like Cooper's seems impossible. That's why we're still talking about it. The case has inspired hundreds of books, dozens of documentaries, feature films, television episodes, songs, and even a play. Robert Downey Jr. optioned a Cooper screenplay that never got made. Treat Williams played a fictionalized Cooper in a 1981 TV movie, The Band Portugal. The man wrote a song called People Say about the mystery. Cooper has become embedded in popular culture in a way few criminals ever achieve. But here's what's fascinating. The legend of D.B. Cooper says more about us than it does about him. We've turned a criminal who terrorized innocent people into a folk hero because his crime appeals to something deep in the American psyche, the lone individual outsmarting the system, beating the odds, disappearing into myth. We celebrate Cooper while simultaneously condemning similar crimes because his story is just too perfect, too cinematic, too compelling to resist. Every generation reinterprets Cooper through its own lens. In the 1970s, he was an anti-establishment rebel. In the 1980s and 90s, he was a mastermind criminal. In the 2000s, he became a forensic puzzle to be solved with technology. Now, in 2025, he's simultaneously all of these things: hero, villain, ghost, mystery. And that's why this case will never truly close, even if we learn Cooper's identity tomorrow. The legend has outgrown the facts. D.B. Cooper is no longer just the man in seat 18C. He's an idea, a possibility, a question mark hovering over American criminal history. So here we are, 54 years after a man calling himself Dan Cooper jumped from a 727 into a November storm and vanished. 54 years of investigation, speculation, theories, and dead ends. 54 years of questions without answers. We know what happened, but we don't know who done it. We know the crime, but not the criminal. We have his DNA, his physical description, artifacts from the scene, and decades of investigative work, but we don't have his name. Not his real name. The evidence suggests Cooper died during or shortly after the jump. Logic, physics, probability, they all point toward death in the Cascade Wilderness, his body never recovered, the money scattered and lost. But evidence isn't certainty, and logic doesn't explain the money at Tina Bar or the lack of remains despite extensive searches. Maybe the 2025 testing of the parachute harness from the McCoy property will finally close this case. Maybe DNA genealogy will identify Cooper within the next few years. Maybe a hiker will stumble across his remains tomorrow, next month, or a decade from now. Or maybe none of those things will happen. Maybe D.B. Cooper will remain exactly what he is right now, the perfect unsolved mystery. But here's what we can say with absolute certainty. On that rainy November evening in 1971, a man did the impossible. He hijacked a commercial aircraft, extorted a fortune, and parachuted into legend. Whether he survived or not, whether he was Richard McCoy or Kenneth Christiansen or Robert Rackstraw or someone we've never suspected, that man changed aviation history, created a legend that's lasted more than half a century, and left behind a mystery that continues to fascinate millions of people. That's not speculation, that's not theory, that's fact. So what do you think happened to D.B. Cooper? Comment your theory below using these numbers. Comment 1 if you believe Cooper died during the jump and his body was never recovered. Comment 2 if you believe Cooper survived the jump, lived under his real identity, and took the secret to his grave. Comment 3 if you believe Cooper was Richard McCoy and Dan Grider's evidence proves it. Let's see what this community thinks happened to America's most mysterious hijacker. If you found this deep dive into the D.B. Cooper case fascinating, hit that subscribe button. We cover cold cases, unsolved mysteries, and true crime investigations that law enforcement can't crack. New episodes drop every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And if you want to support this channel and get early access to episodes plus exclusive content, check out our Patreon in the description. This has been Haunted Case Files. The truth is still out there. We just have to keep looking.